an old friend, Wade Graham. Wade is a historian, gardener, has written some incredible books about cities, about urban gardens and land space, open space. But he's also written some very important pieces recently on Los Angeles County and the fires. And this was the subject that kind of changed the course of this conference. I want to take a moment here before introducing Wade to really thank all of our panelists for changing gears. Again, our plans have changed somewhat since we began planning this conference about 6-9 months ago. In particular, I want to thank the moderators of the other two panels, Jarrett and Nolan Gray. Thank you both for being willing to, again, evolve and change the course of your two panels to think about some of the decisions that we have before us as a region. But I wanted to close in a way that's very Pepperdine. The School of Public Policy is one of the few policy programs that takes what I would argue a great books approach to the field that's often seen as being very technocratic and quantitative. We certainly have those courses there in our curriculum, but we also blend in courses in history and political philosophy as a way of taking a more holistic view of what can often be seen as very technocratic sets of decisions. And I think you even saw today in the panels a mix of kind of technocratic and even technological policy solutions, but also understanding that those are happening within a particular context, one that's both historical and also grounded in a particular place. And I thought no better way to conclude our time together before we adjourn for drinks and community building than to welcome Wade to give us some historical context for the decisions, the policy, the real policy decisions that we have before us here as a region. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Wade Graham.
Guys, yeah, this came together very quickly. I am an historian, and I'm going to take us backwards to try to find a way forward. I'm very taken by this conversation about PCH being slowed down. This is amazing. I moved to Malibu at the age of 16 in 1982, and people were dying like flies on PCH, as they do constantly on PCH. And there was a bumper sticker at the time that said, "Slow your pace on PCH." Malibu parents would distribute these, and the kids would cut them up, put them out, and they said, "Space on PCH," just to give a little cultural context. The point of it being is that these things keep happening. Nothing is changing in a lot of the discussions that we've been having. So first of all, I just want to say that what has happened is just extraordinary, unbelievable devastation. I haven't been into the burn zones yet, but I know people in both fires just lost everything, and just this is an extraordinary thing to live through. And I think there are a lot of things about the recent fires that seem extraordinary to us. The hurricane force wind, just the ferocity of nature, sustained for hours, sustained for days. Explosive spread of these fires. They were fires that were characterized not by a fire front, but by multiple fire fronts, by spotting over miles, by ember casts that was like spark cannons. The speed of them was extraordinary. The numbers being put out there is 3 football fields a minute in certain cases over flat ground and brush. We have the best fire services in the world, the largest, the best funded, the most technologically savvy. They were outmanned, outgunned. They had their asses kicked. The sheer number of simultaneous fires was crazy in this town. They were starting every day while other ones were burning. That seemed apocalyptic. We had chaotic evacuations. We had emergency alert systems didn't work well at all, that failed in many cases, that may have contributed to significant death. And I think the most shocking for most of us is that these fires, I'm really talking about the Eaton and the Palisades fires, they blurred the line between what wildland is supposed to be and city is supposed to be, between out there and town. And there are a lot of things that's an interesting problem. Who lives out there? Who lives in town? Is this supposed to happen to certain people, not to others? I think a lot of our sense of security has been shaken by these fires. It's also the case that, are they brush fires or are they urban structural fires? Is this the Great Fire of Chicago? Is this London in 1666? Or is it, a fire in Yellowstone National Park? Clearly, we're in a new world. Climate change is an accelerant to all of these things. And I think it's exceedingly stark. But I also, what I'm going to do is, as an historian, ask the question, is it really different? Or is it deja vu all over again? And I'm not going to lead with policy questions, certainly not with any solutions. I'm going to kind of let the fires talk, because what I had just done was I wrote for the Huntington, USC Huntington Institute for California in the West had a multidisciplinary, multi-year project called the West on Fire. And they asked me to do a case study of wildland-urban interface fire in the American West. We talked about, where would you do the case study? We said, well, Malibu is where you do the case study. So this is a history, I wrote a history of fire in Malibu. And I finished it in October, just in time for the Franklin fire to burn through the Pepperdine campus and burn through a big part of eastern Malibu. Just in time for January 7th, the Palisades fire, again, to burn through eastern Malibu. It's hard to keep up, you're writing about fire in this town. And I want to consider a few things. We can get to policy at the end. I want to consider a few things. I'm going to talk about nature, I'm going to talk about culture, technology to some extent, money, politics, and money. So why Malibu? What is Malibu, first of all? The city's 21 miles and about a mile. The mountain coastline is 27 miles. It's the Santa Monica Mountains. That's really what we're talking about. So it's Los Angeles County, Ventura County, City of Malibu, City of Los Angeles. It also goes all the way to Griffith Park and the LA River. That's the Santa Monica Mountains. The Hollywood Hills, the Brentwood Canyons, all of it. That's really what we're talking about. When we talk about Malibu, we're talking about Santa Monica Mountains fire. Why Malibu as a case study? It is kind of the perfect place not only to study fire, but to have fire. So it evolved with fire over 10,000 years since the Pleistocene dried the climate out. It is really steep. It is clothed in chaparral, which is an ecosystem that evolved with fire, adapted to fire. It's lined up right with the corridors that bring the Santa Ana winds down from the desert, which is the 14 Pass and the 5 Pass. They line up perfectly with Malibu canyons, and they burn over. It also has all the ingredients for fire disaster, and these are things that we know about. It's really desirable. It's gorgeous. People want to live there. It's right next to a really giant metropolitan region. It also has a lack of land use planning due to many things, cultural reasons, also the governmental fragmentation that we've talked about. It has excellent publicly subsidized infrastructure, nice place to move, and it is protected by one of the best cutting edge fire departments in the world, LA County Fire Department. Add those things up and it is inevitable that there's going to be a history of catastrophic fire loss in this place. So we talk a lot about putting things in harm's way, and you can really see it in Malibu. So it was a Mexican rancho, then it was owned by a wealthy man from Boston who didn't want to develop it. Famously, his widow, May Ringe, blocked development until the 1920s, and she was sort of ruined by lawsuits, so she got into the real estate business and started to sell lots, and famously the movie Colony on Colony Beach, and also sort of scattered development, but didn't really get rolling until the post-war years, and that's when the financial incentives changed. So again, I want to let the fires talk. So there's October 1935, 50-mile-an-hour Santa Ana winds drove a 50-foot wall of flame down Latigo Canyon, and to the west, it burned 28,000 acres and no structures. Why? Because there were no structures. It seems obvious, but it's worth keeping in mind that fire isn't really a problem until we get ourselves in the way. November 1938, a fire in Topanga burned to the west, burned no structures, burned to the east, and it consumed 350 buildings in Mandeville Canyon and Las Flores Canyon. It was put out by 600 men who were mostly arrayed to stop Will Rogers' estate from being burned, which just did burn. 1948, 10 years later, a fire burned through the same pathway, and it threatened 1,250 homes in Topanga alone. So that's harm's way. Christmas 1956, a fire burned through the same canyons as the Latigo fire. It moved over to the west of Canaan and Decker. It burned 26,000 acres. It killed one person and it burned 100 houses. Same fire, footprint. people in harm's way. We have an eyewitness description of that fire by Lawrence Clark Powell, who was the university librarian at UCLA from the 40s to the 60s. He had a house out in Encinal, and he described an extraordinary fire that was spark cannon coming at him. They had to wrap themselves up, get wet, and the fire was burning ahead of the flaming front and couldn't really be put out. He also described a fire camp at Zuma Beach with hundreds and hundreds of firefighters from all over California. Greater Los Angeles had signed a mutual aid agreement in 1941. The state legislature had quickly adopted a similar thing. He saw engines from San Luis Obispo, San Diego. He described it as a war camp. And he said the county services performed, or the fire services performed heroically. Nonetheless, 100 dwellings had burned. There is no consolation in the words of the county fire chief, who said, "There is only one thing certain, it will happen again." So it was not for a lack of firefighting effort in 1956 in Malibu. And this is because firefighting in the 20th century became really an extraordinary location of technology and organization, sort of things that we've been talking about here today. Prior to the 20th century, fire was something people just accepted. It was a normal fact of life, probably beneficial most of the time, something you lived with, dealt with. In the 20th century in the United States, we changed all of that. We decided it was a problem. Bigger and bigger damage led to bigger and bigger investment, bigger and bigger funding. It became called the moral equivalent war to put out all fire in the Great Depression. Second World War we know was a fire war. We dropped fire bombs on cities from airplanes. And in the Cold War, a lot of that technology made its way into firefighting. So we militarized firefighting with bombers, with paratroopers, with ground attack, etc. And the goal of this really was suppression, putting out all fire. In 1935, the United States Forest Service adopted a 10 a.m. rule, which meant that by the 10 a.m. the next morning, a fire would be put out, no matter what the cost, no matter what the effort, no matter where it was. So we started a war on fire in this country. It's extraordinary in the history of the world that a basic element was determined to be intolerable. So one of the things so there's technology. I want to talk about money. So what are people doing as they're moving out there? Southern California grew in explosive ways, a little bit like a fire. It started in the middle and it began to spot and move out and out and out. How did this happen? It did have to do with money. It had, first of all, to do with population doubling every decade. Where are you going to put them? Other cities had other solutions to that. We came up with this new solution, and it was driven by, in some sense, infrastructure. It was driven by the federal government agreeing to pay 90% of the cost to put freeways and highways out there, bringing in water from hundreds or thousands of miles away, bringing in power from hundreds and hundreds of miles away, subsidized services, schools, courts, libraries, police, and of course, fire departments are subsidized, right? The great thing that happened in Los Angeles, which sort of allowed our fire department to become so powerful and so effective, was that in 1958, the state allowed a city called Lakewood to contract out its services to the county, because the county had dog catchers and mosquito control and police and prisons and juvenile delinquents and libraries. Lakewood didn't want to pay for those things, so they signed up with the county. So suddenly the county became like a business. It could sign up paying customers, fire department included. So by 1967, Los Angeles County Fire Department has 23 cities under contract, in addition to unincorporated county. So in effect, those cities are subsidizing people on the wildland fringe. So in 1967, the county probably has 2.5 million people. There's about 10,000 in Malibu, spread over 27 miles, just to give you an example. The other reasons that Southern California grew in this sort of outward way is something that we call the growth machine, this interlocking thing with development interests, politicians, banks, insurance companies, title companies, construction unions, you name it. Everything was about growth. In a sense, it was impossible not to do this. It was financially, politically impossible not to put ourselves in harm's way. And we did put ourselves in harm's way in this extensive way. We talked a lot about sprawl and a mess of the questions that come along with it. People have listed quite a few. They're sort of the same ball of wax, aren't they? Racial segregation, governmental fragmentation, the housing crisis, the transportation crisis, the budget crisis, the environmental crisis, a lot of the same themes have the same, that we've talked about, heard today, have the same origins as the fire crisis. A corollary of that is because of subsidy, and think also about insurance. Until very recently, there was not fine-grained risk mapping in American insurance. You paid about the same wherever you were. You didn't really pay a huge premium until probably this century for living in fire zones. We didn't have fire maps that reflected this until quite recently, and we've seen how inadequate they are. So you have the externalization of risk, and you're making decisions without really reference to risk. It's moral hazard in certain terms. It's also, I think, a cultural element. There's a cultural element to Cold War thinking that we have to remember because we don't live there anymore, but it really shaped everything. In 1963, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power unveiled plans to build the world's largest nuclear plant in Corral Canyon, which if you've been to Corral Canyon, seems like an odd place to put a large nuclear plant. It is the crumbliest geology and the crumbliest mountain range in the county. There's an earthquake fault that runs right up it, and it is the premier pathway of fire over from the valley. And yet they were going to build a nuclear power plant there. So ignoring danger is an American thing. It was really fundamental, particularly to the time period. And I think this is really important. I want to think about what were we thinking? What were they thinking? There's a sense of security that's odd to me that we now are confronted with. And when I say deja vu all over again, when I get to why repetition is sort of needs answering. We were also told in this period that, it didn't matter where you built, and it didn't really matter what you built. Clear the brush, because it's nature's problem, long enough for the fire department to come and save you. You'll be fine. So the post-war suburban supernova, the explosion of Los Angeles County to 4 million people, if it has an architectural indicator species, I would argue that it's the ranch house. We all know what a ranch house is. They're these little low-slung things. They were ironically inspired by Spanish and Mexican ranch buildings, which were low and low-slung, and they had eaves and so on. But they were made out of adobe and tile, basically fireproof. We're Americans. We don't build that way. We built it out of barn material, wood siding, wood shingle roofs. And we built these all over the county. We built them by the hundreds of thousands. And in some sense, you've got to ask why. One thing is it's part of a national phenomenon of kind of a nostalgia for rural life at the time, particularly in the 1950s. Think about, and in the 60s, Westerns accounted for half of all movies and television that were produced in the English language in those years. The television was dominated by, I don't know who's old enough to remember this, the Andy Griffith Show, which was filmed in Culver City. Its exteriors were shot in Franklin Canyon in the Hollywood Hills, if anybody's been there. The Beverly Hillbillies, Petticoat Junction, Green Acres. Think about that period. There was this weird obsession with a kind of rural life somewhere else where there weren't fires. So we built that way. A big report in 1959 by the National Fire Protection Association warned that the increasing use of wood shingles in these brush areas of Los Angeles would result in disaster. The fire services advocated a ban on wood shingle roofs. Nothing was done about it. November 6, 1961, a brush fire started on Mulholland Drive above the Bel Air neighborhood of Los Angeles, which is very much like Malibu. About the same topography, really steep canyons. Santa Ana winds are going to pour over. Development on really windy roads that go up the canyons around the ridges and a few houses, and they all have wood shingle roofs. So this fire starts, 50 mile an hour, 60 mile an hour winds. They start blowing the fire forward. The fire services attack it very, very quickly, and yet they're unable to stop it because it's blowing over their head. Because it's not a brush front, it's firebrands flying through the air, so like something out of World War II. The firemen are watching storms of wood shingles from burning houses fly up in the air in updrafts and then get sent. They fly over the Bel Air Country Club, they fly over the 405, which has just been opened. It wasn't called that at the time. Helicopter pilots flew through clouds of burning shingles, and when they landed, they pulled them out of the aircraft. Pilots reported seeing blocks of houses a mile ahead of the flaming front, all on fire, and the brush around them just fine, all green. They realized they were fighting not a brush fire, but an urban structural fire over multiple fronts, and they did not do well. And it was not for lack of firefighting. Within, I think, 2 hours, 85% of LA City fire resources were put on that fire. It was thousands of firefighters, hundreds and hundreds of engines. This is just LA City before the responding agencies arrived. Helicopters in the air, B-17 bombers in the air. And yet that fire went out when the wind slowed down. 505 buildings were burned, 6,000 acres. 200 firefighters were injured. 70% of the buildings burned had wooden roofs. No surprise. Though they were only 50% of the buildings in the zone, 14% of the buildings with non-wood roofs, 14% built. Okay, seems fairly obvious. And yet the building codes were not changed until 20 years later. And if you go to some of the canyons in Brentwood, some of the nicest canyons in Brentwood, anybody been up Sullivan Canyon or Old Ranch Road? You see these beautiful little ranch houses, many of them designed by Cliff May, who was the master of the ranch house. They have wooden shingle roofs. They have little wooden corrals with horses looking at you. They're in the front yard. It's dramatically wonderful. One of the most desirable places in Los Angeles, unchanged. So it goes on. I like to let the fires talk. In 1970, in a 2-week period, 12 wildfires burned at the same time in Southern California. It's a regional problem. At the same time, they burned 500,000 acres, killed 16 people, and destroyed 700 structures. The response was, in the fire community, to just get better. They started adapting better aircraft. They invented the Super Scooper, or rather they leased it from Canada. They got together and invented something called the Incident Command System, just for Los Angeles County Fire, Southern California fire groups to manage these emergencies better. That went on to be adopted at the national level, at the international level. It's now the basis of crisis response in almost all fields. And yet, didn't really make any difference. It kept happening. You can't put, there's no amount of firefighting was really going to help. Part of that firestorm, in 1970, a fire went down Malibu Canyon right through the construction site at that time of Pepperdine University. It followed the exact footprint of the 58 fire. It burned 30,000 acres and it razed 100 houses. In October of 78, a fire burned down the same scar in Canaan, burned 25,000 acres, 230 houses. In that fire, the house that Lawrence Clark Powell had been defending in 1956 was burned, finally. Little one-story house, they couldn't afford to rebuild it, they sold the land, and immediately a 2-story house goes up on the same lot. And Lawrence Clark Powell at that time, an older man, he was upset. And he lamented this cycle that he saw up and down the California coast, up and down California. He said, in a feverish buying and selling of land, the coast has become utterly transformed and unrecognizable. Each succeeding house, bigger and grander, takes the views of its neighbors in a kind of unbridled competition. Has anybody seen this? Neighborhood goes down, 1-story houses, 4 stories replace it. So I've seen this in Malibu 3 cycles, and it just happened again in the area behind the beach club at Carbon. Those houses are on they're going to be on their 4th cycle, and they will be bigger. Every fire, lost in the Palisades, every house lost in the Palisades is going to be 110% of its former size. So fire gentrification is really an old phenomenon. It's not speculative at all. It's really old. That's 1978. We're seeing it again in real time in the Palisades and particularly in Altadena. It's a real worry. We're really losing some very, very special places. So the question is, for me, I see these fires over and over again. I have the longest list. And it brings me back to this idea that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So people say that Albert Einstein said that. Apparently not. Apparently, it was first surfaced in a publication, a 1981 publication from Narcotics Anonymous. Narcotics Anonymous. So it's addiction. So is this a metaphor or is this an explanatory mechanism? I think it's an explanatory mechanism why we keep doing the same thing over, because it is unprofitable not to. It is unaffordable not to do the same thing over again. Property values go up after fires. All of the financial structures that put us there in the first place are doubled down upon in the event of crisis. We talk here about, do you suspend policy? Do you cut the red tape? Red tape is just policy, public policy. We're in this situation again. We're in that quandary again. Do we do this again? Do we do it the same way? Have we learned anything? Will we learn anything? On the question of whether these are extraordinary fires, I have a long list of more fires, which I won't read. In the last 95 years, 30 significant fires have burned through Malibu. A third of those have burned the exact same footprint in one place. There are corridors of fire, and they are reasonably well developed. So when I moved to Malibu from Santa Barbara as a 16-year-old, we rented a little cottage on Corral Beach, and the 1982 Dayton fire burned right over the pass, same thing, down Corral Canyon, right through Malibu Canyon, right through the Pepperdine campus, and it was stopped at the road across from our house by fire engines from Montana. We had surfboards on the beach in case we had to paddle away. You know what happened in Lahaina, so that's not light. That burn scar has burned 5 more times since 1982, and there are more houses there than there were before. So in 2018, we had the Woolsey fire, right? Just talking about, are these different? Is something different? So the Woolsey fire was extraordinary. It burned more than half the mountain range. It moved to the ocean in something like 12 hours. It jumped a 12-lane freeway with ease. No amount of firefighting was ever going to stop that fire. It exhibited the same issues that we saw in the recent fires, the crazy fire behavior, the explosive spread, the long-range spotting, the fronts in all directions could not be fought frontally, and it went out when the wind died or came down enough so that all of those nice aircraft could actually function very, very well. The speed of the fire was extraordinary at that time. Number of structures destroyed was extraordinary at that time, it seemed to us at the time. 300,000 people were evacuated. It was a mess. People were not abandoning cars, but they were not moving. Emergency alerts didn't work. Communication didn't work. The billions and billions of damage. And I want to point out that the other fire that we think about in terms of these terms of like extraordinary fire, it started on the same day. The Camp Fire started on the same day as the Woolsey fire up in Northern California in Butte County. And that one was incredible. Different kind of vegetation, made no difference. It burned through 55,000 acres in 12 hours. The speed was the decisive factor in the death of 85 people. Same kinds of problems, hampering communication, poor evacuation planning, poor land use planning, no building codes, wooden houses. So are these fires different or are they not different? One thing that is true is that global warming is real. I said it was an accelerant. It's like gasoline accelerant. So we're seeing fires now where the speed that they're traveling is unprecedented, in fact, and this has to do with wind velocity just going up to hurricane force. And we're seeing fires now that don't really involve vegetation at all, or they involve grass. So the fires in Lahaina were in grass. The fires in Colorado were in grass. Fires in Oklahoma and Nebraska 2 summers ago they burned something like 5 million acres in a matter of hours. So the whole paradigm that we have lived with, that we've developed with, that we've become, we've rested our security on this paradigm that you just manage the vegetation, you clear the brush, or you rake your forests, whatever you want to call it, until the firefighters get there. This is not going to work. It's not going to work. It may never have worked, but it certainly does not work now. What happened in Altadena, what happened in downtown Palisades, this structure-to-structure wiping out of urban neighborhoods, urban fire, old-fashioned urban fire, now driven by wind. We saw it in 2017 in the Tubbs fire, which was a brush fire in wine country, burned into the city of Santa Rosa. It jumped the 101, again, 8 lanes, plus an arterial road. It ignited buildings that were surrounded by parking lots. There wasn't a wisp of chaparral anywhere near anything, and burned them to the ground. We're in a different world. Climate change is real, global warming is real, and yet the paradigm, so just some of these figures, the accelerant. In the last 40 years, the amount of acreage burned annually in California has quintupled in 40 years. In the last 5 years, the 10 biggest fires in the history of California burned. In the last 10 years, 12 of the biggest, now 14 of the 20 biggest. So for sure, we are in a different world. Is it really a different world? That's why I'm doing this, because I want us to think about this. Why is it that the same thing continues to happen, and how do we find a way out of it? So for sure, I don't really come with conclusions, but there are a couple of things that we do know. The first one is, do you remember the three little pigs? One little pig built his house out of straw, and the big bad wolf blew it down. The next little pig built his house out of sticks, and the big bad wolf blew it down. The third little pig built out of bricks, and the big bad wolf huffed and puffed, and he couldn't blow it down. So you see these eerie pictures from fire zones. All pictures from wildland urban fire zones look like this. There's devastation, and there's a chimney. This shouldn't be that hard to learn. Pete mentioned earlier the example of Pepperdine University campus. It was built by William Pereira, designed in the late, built in 1970, or design was 1970, who had previously done this master plan for Malibu, for the Ringe heirs, not all of Malibu, for their land. And he had spent a lot of time, he was a world traveler and a playboy, and he spent a lot of time traveling the Mediterranean by private yacht. And he was very impressed by what he saw from an architectural and a planning point of view, particularly the island of Patmos in Greece. It's in the Aegean Sea, and it suffers from horrifying seasonal winds. Horrifying seasonal winds. You cannot stand up. And yet the villages of Patmos had been there for, nobody knows, 5,000 years. They're intact, they're fine. He said, how do they do this? They don't use combustible materials on the outside. They put their back to the wind direction. We know the wind direction, we do too. We do here too, it's consistent. Fire doesn't come from the ocean. The ocean is wet wind, it comes from the other direction. They put their back to it. They cluster the collective functions on the inside in plazas that don't have vegetation, that are either paved or they have grass. They're marketplaces, something like that. And Patmos has been there for 5,000 years. They're clustered together, mostly open space, agricultural space. He designed Pepperdine and Malibu in this exact way, and it has held up. I was just there. I hadn't seen how far the Franklin fire went, but it just skipped right through. 7th fire since the campus was built, and they haven't lost as much as a fence post, I don't think. So we need to learn the lessons of how to build, what to build, how to build. These are technological problems, or they're not. If they've been doing it for 5,000 years, it's a cultural problem. It's the policy problem that you guys have been talking about. And it's linked to all the other problems that we've been talking about. The connection to transportation, clustering, the density, carbon emissions, equity. All of this stuff is the same problem. And so, Pereira wasn't designing single-family homes. He was designing a community at Pepperdine. And so he took a community model, and it has been successful. And I think from an urbanistic point of view, that's something we need to put right in the middle of this. So one, no more ranch houses in Southern California. If you're gonna have a little one-story house, make it the way the Mexicans did. Adobe, tile roofs, no wood. And don't build it up in the hills. Second question really, I think, is in terms of conclusions, it's who's gonna pay? So the growth machine model is over, for sure. Subsidized infrastructure isn't so easy as it was in the Cold War. The insurance system is collapsing, apparently. But it's not collapsing for everybody. It seems as though Rick Caruso isn't going to have a problem insuring anything up there, or these wealthy folks who want to buy their neighbors in the Palisades and build on 3 lots. Insurance doesn't seem to be a problem. It is going to be a problem for a lot of the residents of Altadena. So the equity issues here are enormous, and I don't pretend to have answers to those. I simply want to mention those, that they are there. Infrastructure and services are going to be something we have to think really carefully about. So now most ignitions in California, in the WUI, are in wildland urban interface, are electrical infrastructure. There are power lines going down. There are transformers popping, things that are happening of this nature. So the solution seems to be to just turn them off. But remember, why are there power lines in these places? Why are there power lines going this way and that way in crazy environments? Because we believed that no one should have to pay the true cost of where they live. It's an expression of support for farmers from the New Deal that then became an expression of support for people who wanted to live in suburban locations that were flammable. So the extension of an electricity grid was a choice made in the Cold War, or prior, but in the mid-century, which is really interesting and questionable and leads into other questions about climate resiliency that we don't have time to talk about. But I want to put at the forefront of the problem is infrastructure. It's not just buildings, it's not just vegetation, it's not just how many firefighters, it's not just the wind. It is in fact a whole way that we undergird the society because we didn't have to pay for it. Federal government paid for 90% of all of this stuff. They're not going to do it anymore, at least for the next 4 years. So those are important things. I think lastly, I want to say that we haven't talked about the environmental consequences of this level of fire. So this is not the 10,000 years of fire that this world evolved with. It's a different world of fire. And this level and frequency of fire is destroying the ecosystems. And the consequences of that are going to be really, really extraordinary. So we need to think hard about the fact that we're putting fire out in the world and it's causing problems not just to us, but to most of California is wild land. And 56% of it is chaparral ecosystems from the Oregon border to Baja California. We risk losing those ecosystems if fire continues to grow and grow and grow. So there's an environmental component to this that should be put there. And then I also want to say that I think this question of what do you do in a crisis is really, really crucial. Cutting red tape, this comes to the core of we do need to cut red tape. We need to reimagine what our goals are. Because again, most of our policy, so the Coastal Act was 1979, 1970? California Coastal Act 1969, okay? CEQA, early 70s, right? 73. So we preceded the national legislation. So California Coastal Act 69, National Coastal Act 70, or Marine, whatever they called it. California 73 for CEQA, NEPA 74, signed by Richard Nixon. These are really old structures that probably also aren't really set for a place where the wind is going to blow at hurricane strength down your street for days on end. So yeah, we're in a new world. But I would argue that it's not really a natural new world necessarily, or even a technological new world. What it is a policy new world that we need to adjust to. So the conclusion, the answers to what we do about these fires have to be informed by this kind of deep history, that it is new, but it's also not new. And so I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we have a good conversation about what to do next.
Yes, thank you.